Thank you so much for inviting me here to speak tonight about what's happening with Syria. So today I was reading the news and two headlines in particular caught my attention. The first one was from the United Kingdom, the Telegraph newspaper. The headline was, "The USA has 2 weeks to save Syria from the Russian Armada or lose its last scraps of moral authority." The second headline was from the Washington Post, and it read, "Washington's foreign policy elite breaks with Obama over Syrian bloodshed." This indicates to me a consensus in the media regarding what's happening in Syria. There isn't really a question of what's happening, but so how quickly is the U.S. going to intervene in this question? We have 2 weeks in the first headline. The second headline says that it doesn't matter who's going to be elected president. The same thing is going to happen. Somebody is going to intervene. There was also, if anybody had the stomach to watch the debate last night, and you noticed how the candidates themselves were speaking about Syria, there was also a consensus here in what was happening. But I thought it really important to point out that the moderator who was actually asking the questions at one point mentioned that the city of Aleppo had 250,000 residents in it. Now, the city of Aleppo is actually the largest city in Syria, population-wise. It has a population of over 2 million. So when they're speaking about 250,000 people who are living in Aleppo, right, they're actually just speaking about one part of Aleppo. They're speaking about East Aleppo. They're speaking about the part of town where only a little bit more than 10% of its current population is living. And they are saying that since these people are the bodies that we are going to use to justify an imperial onslaught on Syria, they are the only ones that really count, right? We're not even going to count the extra 1-point-something million of Syrians who are living in Aleppo, because as far as empire is concerned, they don't even exist. Now, what's really chilling to me about this is that this number was just sort of thrown off of the top of someone's head, but it went out to tens of millions of Americans who are watching. So tens of millions of Americans right now have the impression that the largest city in Syria is actually smaller than the city of Cleveland, population-wise. All of this is part of shaping the discourse around what's happening in Syria and establishing facts that are just not going to be argued or not going to be questioned, that are going to be used to justify what's called a no-fly zone. Now, we might have a really good idea in this room of what a no-fly zone means, but I think I should explain it anyway. A no-fly zone, the Pentagon has already said, back before Russia became involved in what was happening in Syria, the Pentagon has already said that there will be more than 70,000 U.S. Armed Forces personnel needed in order to implement a no-fly zone in Syria. A no-fly zone in Syria means that U.S. jets and U.S. bombs will be dropped all over Syria, not just to shoot planes out of the air, as some people, are under the impression of what a no-fly zone is, but also to bomb and destroy Syrian government infrastructure that's on the ground. Basically, a no-fly zone means that you destroy anything that could put a plane in the air, that could take somebody to an airstrip to be able to put a plane in the air. Also, notably, a no-fly zone always precedes the U.S.'s regime change policy. So wherever you have found a no-fly zone implemented over a country, you will find that regime change is soon to follow. Now, putting a no-fly zone in the minds of the American population and also the English-speaking world and media all over the world is part of a coordinated and well-funded PR effort that's funded by the U.S. government, U.S. aid, probably the CIA, although of course they don't release numbers of how much they spend on these things in specific, the UK and other governments, including Gulf governments as well. Now, I didn't mention this in my notes earlier, but I do want to point out that in 2013, there was a defense spending bill that was passed that partially repealed what was called the Smith-Mundt Act, which is a law that basically requires that the U.S. government cannot broadcast information that's intended for a foreign audience to its own population, which basically means that parts of the U.S. government were now able to sort of propagandize openly to the rest of the United States. This is unprecedented, I think, at least as far as I can pull back in my mind. I know, of course, that the government has found its way of broadcasting at us before, but I think that the coordinated effort to justify a no-fly zone in Syria has benefited greatly from this. We have lots of different organizations that are basically taking money from invisible sources to be able to put out information that is questionable at best, such as there are only 250,000 people who are living in Aleppo. It's also used grotesque photos of children and wounded people to be able to try and call for more war. Once again, these bodies, these Syrian people do not exist unless they are used as tools to try and justify an onslaught against Syria. And also there's been a coordinated campaign of bullying. People who dare to ask these sorts of questions face all sorts of repercussions. I've known of people who have received phone calls, who have received emails, who have had their jobs threatened, who have lost their jobs because of their views on Syria. So what this sort of does overall, this good funding, and I'm talking, I guess, these different campaigns, it's hard to track down exactly how much funding they're getting, because they, even though they might be based out of PR organizations that are based in New York, they'll run it through like a London shell company, basically, to hide the money. But there has been, I guess the CIA has said that it's spent over $1 billion already in trying to foment regime change in Syria. We can assume that that number is probably larger when it comes down to how much the entire US government has spent and how much its allies have spent on the effort as well. Now, but all of these things together sort of create this illusion of a consensus, like a false consensus. When we watch the debate, when we open up the newspapers, there is no question about what is happening in Syria. The question is, how hard and how fast are we going to destroy Syria in order to save Syria, or to defend Syria against the Russian armada, which I think is sort of incredible that people would even be suggesting that we just sort of ramp up war that fast for almost no reason. So this illusion of consensus needs to be challenged, and that's why I was really heartened to see the Hands Off Syria Coalition statement that was released last week, I believe it was. And I would like to point out 2 points in particular. Point, I guess, number 6 and number 7. So the points of this is basically to talk about how the approach as to what's happening in Syria right now is illegal. It goes against the letter and spirit of international law. It goes against the UN Charter, and it also goes against the maybe I got the wrong ones. Sorry, it goes against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as well. And it also sort of challenges it doesn't really challenge, but it disregards like Syrian national sovereignty in general. I think that now, as the election draws closer, and as certain people do see that there isn't really much debate going on about whether or not we're going to be going to war with Syria, even more than we already are, that we'll be escalating things. I think that as more people start to wake up and kind of like ask the right questions, or read the right facts, or come together in these sorts of coalitions, I feel like it's really important for us all to support one another and to show unity in the face of this imperialist onslaught. So thank you again for having me speak. I hope that everyone gets a chance to sign the coalition, sign to the coalition, and thank you very much. Talk about Joe's question first, because I think it's a really good and important question. He was asking about what happens if you have someone who tells you that they have an opinion and it's because they are of this nationality, or they are from this country, etc., or they see themselves as being from there. Even if they might have been born in a different country, they would identify as being Syrian, even if they were born in Kuwait and raised in Lebanon, or born in Lebanon and raised in London, for instance, you know. But generally what I do is, so for instance, I have a friend of mine, right? And she's like my last, what we would call normie friend. And I love her so much. She's like, you know, I've known her for years. And she's Cuban American, right? And so she usually knows not to talk about this with me unless we've like had a whole bottle of wine together. And then she'll usually say something along the lines of like, well, but you think that my grandfather should have had everything taken away from him then? You think that was right? And I say, look, you know, I don't know what your grandfather had. Like, I don't really know what the situation was, but I don't think that it's fair to take your individual experience and use that to sort of judge an entire revolution that increased the standard of living of so many people worldwide, not just in Cuba. And I think it's much to the same with regards to the question of what's happening in Syria. I know that there are a lot of people who say, you know, I'm Syrian and therefore everyone should listen to me, and if I ask for a no-fly zone, then I better well get a no-fly zone. But I think that since they're asking for a no-fly zone, they should be able to listen to what the people who they're asking it from have to say about it. right? Like, I think that if they're going to sit there and say, well, I think this because I am of this and I need you to immediately deliver on it, it's like, well, I think I should probably have the right to ask questions about it, or ask how this question is coming up, or ask how we got into this situation to begin with. I don't know if this is a general strategy that everyone has, but this is generally what I do, is I say, look, it's not fair, right, to have your experience be reflective of an entire country, right? It's not fair to have your unique life path like determine everyone else's situation where you're from, or everyone's situation where I'm from, So I feel like it's better to sort of bring it back to the things that we know and like material reality as to like what's going on with Syria and what's going on with the United States, and the fact that we've had to face down an incredibly horrible summer of watching people get murdered by cops here. And I think that these are issues that do intersect, and I really I think that the movement is the most dangerous to the capitalists and the bourgeoisie when we make that connection between the struggle here and the struggle abroad. I learned almost everything good in my head from the Palestinian solidarity movement and from Palestinians, because I sat there and I could look at my own country with totally new eyes in a way, and I could sit there and say, my God, there are people here who are treated like Palestinians. I've always done my very utmost to be anti-racist and try and stand against the Klan and stuff, but it was really making that connection between what happens overseas and what's happening here that made me motivated to follow communism, to go and read Marx and Lenin and explore that more. So I'm really excited. I really would love to see the statement that the Moorhead Lilly campaign would put out in regards to Syria. I think that, though, for closing remarks more generally, this might not seem to have to do with anything else I've said tonight, but I don't know if anyone else read that the Great Barrier Reef is dead. It's gone. The Great Barrier Reef. It was the only thing that you could see from space that was alive, right? So it's gone now. It's gone. They've been saying they were going to lose it for years, and it's gone. And I feel like it's sort of like that frog in a pan, when you have the frog that sits there and the water's getting hotter and hotter and nobody really realizes it because it's going so slow. But I think that this is the kind of situation that we find ourselves in globally with regards to nuclear war. I'm 31 years old, and so I remember when the Soviet Union was around, just barely. But I wasn't really raised having to duck and cover. I wasn't raised with the specter of nuclear war. I wasn't raised during an anti-war movement. And I feel like now, when people are so kind of like distracted and confused or torn between two different fronts that are really just the same front, that would be like the best time to have nuclear war, is when everybody doesn't remember the serious threat of it. When people don't remember what a world war looks like because everybody is dead, or everybody who's old enough to remember what World War II was like, or what Vietnam was like, isn't listened to anymore, or isn't consulted, or maybe they just don't have the kind of strength in the movement that they used to have. So I think it's really dire times, and I've seen with my own two eyes, like as you have, Joe, the absolute depths of depravity that these people will go to, including killing off the Great Barrier Reef, including dropping nuclear weapons on people, including dropping white phosphorus on hospitals and stuff. And I think that maybe it's sort of an ostrich with its head in the sand sort of thing, but I think it's really important to sort of get this bug in people's ears, that it's not just about this one thing, or it's not just about this one person, but it's about the Great Barrier Reef and the entire planet. So anyway, thank you.